Welcome to another deep dive, and this one is a sensitive one. We're going to be talking about biracial identity,
Yeah.
specifically for people with black and white heritage.
Yeah, it's complex,
It
right?
is complex, so we're hoping to unpack some of the nuances here.
For sure.
And the jumping off point is a YouTube video by a creator named Hammer.
Okay.
And the title of the video is "Biracial People Are Not Black."
Interesting.
And it's essentially an analysis of another video by a biracial woman
Okay.
named Gia, who opens up about her own kind of complex feelings about race.
I see. So it's like a reaction video.
It is a reaction video, yeah, and I think what both of them offer is like a really raw and unfiltered look at, this experience of straddling two racial worlds.
Gotcha.
So, I guess our mission here is to kind of like unpack those nuances, understand Hammer's interpretation of this woman's story, and then sort of like zoom out and see how their experiences reflect larger societal issues about race and belonging.
Yeah, I think that's really important because it's not just about these two individuals, right?
Right.
It's about like a broader conversation.
Exactly. Yeah, so where Hammer starts is this concept called the one-drop rule,
Yeah.
which historically categorized anyone with even a trace of Black ancestry as Black.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And what he points out is that this rule is mainly enforced by Black communities,
Mm.
unlike other racial or ethnic groups. So, like, for example, if you had someone of mixed Japanese and Middle Eastern heritage, they might not be accepted by the Japanese community as Japanese.
That's interesting. So it really like prompts us to think about how these cultural differences impact racial categorization.
Right. It's like who gets to decide what box you fit into and how much of that is like dictated by the culture you're in.
For sure.
And then Gia's video kind of adds another layer to this. She talks about this lifetime of feeling like an outsider, never really fitting in with Black or white communities.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a really common experience for biracial people.
Yeah. And like, she mentions that she gets these questions all the time, like, what are you?
Oh, yeah, I can see how that would get old.
And even though it might be well-intentioned, it still kind of highlights this pressure to categorize people.
Right. Exactly. And especially for biracial individuals, that can be incredibly challenging.
Yeah, and there's this one line from Gia's video that just like, it really hit me hard. She says, "I've spent my whole life asserting the ways and making sure people knew that I'm not Black, I'm mixed."
Wow.
Like that statement to me just speaks volumes.
It does. It really makes you think about like the desire to distance yourself from a category that's been historically marginalized and devalued.
Yeah.
It speaks to the power of societal norms and how they
Yeah.
often prioritize whiteness.
Right, and that brings us to this idea of internalized racism,
Mm-hmm.
which both Hammer and Gia touch on, and they argue that biracial individuals, especially those with Black heritage, often feel this immense pressure to conform to Eurocentric beauty standards
Yeah.
and to downplay their Blackness.
Like to fit in more with white society.
Exactly, and Gia even recounts how, like, straightening her hair led to better treatment.
Wow, that's a really stark example of colorism in action.
It is, and I think it's important to understand that when we talk about internalized racism, we're not talking about like conscious prejudice.
Right.
We're talking about absorbing these negative messages about your own racial group to the point where they become part of your own beliefs.
And that can lead to self-doubt, self-rejection,
Totally.
even a desire to distance yourself from your own heritage.
And that kind of leads to like maybe the most powerful moment in Gia's video, which is this tearful confession about the shame and fear that she associates with Blackness.
Oh, wow.
And she even admits that she felt more comfortable coming out as gay than embracing her Black heritage.
Yeah, that's a heavy stuff.
It is. It's heavy stuff. And it really kind of lays bare these deeply ingrained societal hierarchies.
Right, and how they elevate whiteness and diminish Blackness.
Totally.
Creating this psychological burden for individuals who are grappling with their biracial identity.
Yeah. And it makes you realize that, these conversations that we have are not just about like abstract concepts.
Right.
We're talking about real people, real emotions, and real life consequences of how society views race.
For sure. And it's important to remember that the emotional toll of racial classification is often compounded by historical trauma and ongoing systemic racism.
Right. It's all interconnected. And then here's where things take an interesting turn in Gia's video is she starts to kind of embrace a broader view of Blackness.
Okay.
Seeing it as this diverse and inclusive umbrella, encompassing many experiences and heritages. And she even says, quote, Blackness is an umbrella that has room for people like us, and it's important right now to own that and to sit under that umbrella, because the more we come together and the more we support each other, the more change that can happen.
Powerful.
It is powerful, and it kind of speaks to this idea of reclaiming Blackness as a source of solidarity
Yes.
and collective power,
Especially in the face of oppression.
essentially in the face of oppression. But then here's where Hammer's interpretation comes in,
Okay.
and it throws a wrench into things.
Well,
He sees Gia's emotional turmoil as proof that biracial individuals shouldn't be forced into the Black classification if they resist it. And he even goes so far as to call for the Black diaspora to reject the one-drop rule entirely.
that's a pretty bold statement.
It is a bold statement, and it kind of forces us to consider, like, what are the potential implications of rejecting this concept that's historically served as a unifying force against racism?
Right. So on the one hand, you have individual choice and the freedom to define your own identity.
Uh-huh.
But on the other hand, you have this potential risk of weakening a sense of collective identity.
And this is where I think it gets really tricky, right? Because it's like, are we saying that because someone is uncomfortable with a label that we should just do away with the label, even though the label was created to oppress people?
Right. It raises the question of whether we should dismantle systems based on the discomfort of those who have benefited from those systems.
Well, exactly.
It's a complex issue with valid points on all sides.
It is. And I think, Gia's story and Hammer's analysis really highlight just how much is at stake in these conversations about race and identity.
Absolutely.
We're not just talking about abstract ideas here. We're talking about real people's lives and how they navigate a world that is often very quick to categorize and judge them.
And it highlights the need for empathy and understanding as we navigate these conversations.
Exactly. We need to be mindful of the language we use and recognize that everyone's experience is valid and deserves to be heard.
For sure.
And I think one of the most important takeaways from this is that identity is not fixed. It's something that evolves and changes over time.
It's a journey.
It's a journey, and we need to respect that journey and create space for people to define themselves on their own terms.
Exactly.
And I think there's so much more to explore here, so stay tuned for part 2, where we'll continue to unpack Hammer and Gia's perspectives that really delve deeper into the heart of this complex conversation.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. One thing that I thought was really interesting in Hammer's video was how he talked about the historical context of the one-drop rule.
Yeah.
He argued that it wasn't really about, celebrating Black heritage or anything like that.
Right.
It was really a tool used during slavery and segregation to control and subjugate
Oh, yeah.
people with any Black ancestry.
It's about power.
Exactly. So, like, when he's calling for people to reject the one-drop rule, it makes you think, like, is he saying that by holding on to this concept, Black communities are kind of unintentionally perpetuating a system that was designed to harm them?
It's a really interesting question, right? Because it challenges us to think about how the legacy of racism still shapes our thinking about race even today.
But then on the other hand, couldn't you argue that the one-drop rule has also been a source of unity and solidarity within the Black community?
Absolutely. Like it created this shared identity based on a history of struggle and resilience.
So it seems like we're kind of grappling with a paradox here.
Yeah, a real paradox. And it's a good reminder that there are so many diverse perspectives within the Black community, and there's no single answer that's going to resonate with everyone.
For sure. Hammer also talks about how differently biracial individuals are treated globally. And he gives the example of South Africa, where they have a separate racial category called colored for people of mixed race.
Yeah, it's interesting how different societies construct these categories.
Yeah.
And what impact that has on people's sense of self.
It really makes you think, like, can we move beyond these rigid racial classifications altogether?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. It's a big question, and it feels like something that a lot of people are wrestling with these days.
Yeah, the traditional categories just don't seem adequate anymore.
Especially in a world that's becoming more and more multiracial.
Exactly.
This deep dive is really making me reconsider my own assumptions about race and identity.
Me too. It's challenging me to think more deeply about these issues.
And I think one of the things that really stands out for me is that these conversations are not just intellectual exercises.
Right.
They have a real impact on people's lives.
Absolutely.
How they're treated, how they see themselves.
And it highlights the importance of listening to the voices of those who are navigating the complexities of biracial identity.
For sure. And remembering that even well-intentioned questions like, what are you, can be hurtful.
Oh, totally.
It can make people feel like they don't belong anywhere.
Right. It reinforces that sense of otherness.
Exactly. So it's just a reminder to be mindful of our language and
Yeah.
approach these conversations with sensitivity and respect.
And to remember that identity is not a fixed thing,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
It's a journey of self-discovery
A journey.
and exploration.
Yeah, and we need to honor people's choices as they define their own sense of self, even if it challenges our preconceived notions of race and belonging.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really insightful conversation so far, and there's still so much more to unpack. So in part 3, we're going to delve deeper into the implications of Hammer's argument and discuss potential paths forward.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive, and we've covered a lot of ground right. From the one-drop rule and all its baggage,
Yeah.
to Gia's really personal experiences with internalized racism.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
A lot to unpack, and of course, Hammer's argument about rejecting the one-drop rule.
Uh-huh.
So let's revisit that for a second, because it feels like the heart of the issue.
Okay.
So he believes that Gia's emotional confession, when she said she's more comfortable coming out as gay than embracing her blackness,
Right.
that proves his point that biracial people shouldn't be forced into a racial category.
Basically, he sees her pain as a direct consequence of the one-drop rule.
Exactly. And he's saying it's time to just let go of this whole way of classifying race.
Which is a pretty radical idea when you think about it.
It is radical. And it makes you wonder, right? Like, is Gia's discomfort with being labeled black coming from the very racism that Hammer's trying to dismantle?
It's like we're saying it's okay to internalize these negative messages about your own racial group.
Yeah.
And just kind of distance yourself from it.
Instead of actually challenging those messages and dismantling the systems that create them.
Exactly. And I think that's where it gets really tricky.
Right, because it feels like we're almost giving people a pass to benefit from systems of oppression.
Yeah, to opt out of the struggle.
Without even acknowledging that those systems exist.
And I think it's important to remember the historical context here.
For sure.
The one-drop rule wasn't created to celebrate diversity.
Right, it was a tool of oppression.
It was used to deny people their humanity and their rights.
And now we're saying we should just abandon it because some people feel uncomfortable.
It just feels like we're reinforcing the same power dynamics that created the problem in the first place.
Yeah, and what about the idea of solidarity? For many in the Black community, that one-drop rule has been a source of strength.
A way to unite against oppression.
Exactly. So to reject it now could actually weaken that solidarity.
It's a double-edged sword, for sure.
It is a double-edged sword, and I think this is where the conversation gets really nuanced.
Because there are valid points on both sides.
There are valid points, and I think the important thing is to keep talking about it.
To listen to different perspectives.
And to challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah, to really examine our own biases and think critically about these issues.
And to remember that this isn't just an academic debate.
Right.
These are real people's lives we're talking about.
And their experiences matter.
They do matter, and I think ultimately what we're striving for is a world where everyone feels seen and valued.
Absolutely.
No matter how they choose to identify.
Where race is no longer used to divide and oppress.
Exactly. So this has been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has.
And we've just scratched the surface of a really complex issue.
But I think it's a conversation worth having.
It is a conversation worth having, and we hope that you, our listeners, will continue this conversation with us.
Share your thoughts, your questions, your experiences.
Let's learn from each other and work towards a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring.